Hello and welcome to this video on secondary characters. They're important. Secondary characters in stories help add dimension and give more substance to stories. They can be very instrumental in the development of your primary character, yet there are some pitfalls to avoid. So, moving forward, when we look at secondary characters, let's pretend that we have a main character here and she's got two best friends. Okay, when I look at this picture, how am I going to distinguish the difference between these best friends? What characteristics am I going to give them? Now, we can look at them right now and say, well, they have different hair lengths. One likes to wear longer earrings, any number of things that we can pick out. But how are we going to create them as distinct, unique individuals and not just signposts? This is what we want to avoid. When we have secondary characters that can be replaced with a signpost, that there's nothing interesting about them except for they just hold information, that's a problem. In looking at video games, if you're familiar with any kind of video games that are like role-playing, there's something called NPCs, non-player characters. And in a lot of games, you go up and talk to them, and they will repeat the same information over and over and over to anyone who talks to them. That is a signpost. There's nothing unique or distinct about them that makes them change or grow or be different. So we want to make sure that we are avoiding signposts. Well, how do we do that? Let me give you an example from my latest book, national bestseller. The primary character, well, at least one of the primary characters, because it's told from two different points of view. One of the primary characters is named Kendra White. She is a black female. She is a high school teacher. She is a mother, and she is a scientist who writes this book, which catches the national attention, and people get freaked out over it, and it becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I needed to have a character to be kind of her best friend at the school, and so I decided on the character of Louisa. Now, when I decided on Louisa, I decided that Louisa was going to be a Spanish teacher, that she was actually from Brazil, she was single, and she had pale complexion with red hair. And the reason I did this chose these characteristics or for a few different reasons. I made her single, so that kind of contrasts against what Kendra has to deal with. I made her pale with red hair, which makes her kind of stand out because that's not very common in Brazil, though it is a thing. There are actually quite a few students that we have dealt with that are from Brazil that have red hair. But it makes her kind of stand out and be distinct. She's from Brazil, so her primary language is actually not Spanish, but it is Portuguese. So the fact that she is actually teaching her second language as a teacher, because there's a greater need for Spanish teachers than there are Portuguese teachers in the United States of America. So this gives her a little bit of distinction, to the point where we want to make sure that she's not so strange that it's unbelievable. Yet at the same time, I added these characteristics for her because she acts as a different point of view and has different insight on the situation that's happening than Kendra does, because Louisa has a different background. Now, things to consider when it comes to creating a secondary character. There should be at least something about them which makes them stand out from the crowd, something different about them. And if you think about it, sometimes people, depending on where you work or if you go to school, and they say, I'm looking for so-and-so. Oh, he's the tall one, or she's the one with the glasses, or he's the one that wears cowboy boots. Often, we as individuals will assign a single characteristic to an individual as a way of distinguishing them from other people. Sometimes when the secondary characteristics have very little to do with the story, a single characteristic is all we need. It's something to make them stand out and be different. Now, having said that, one of the most common ways that people do that is to choose people's eye colors. Well, that's good, but that's something that we need to be careful about. And I may sound a little hypocritical here because I chose someone with red hair, which is not super common. Granted, I have red hair and I've got a daughter who has red hair, and so I know a lot of people with red hair. So for me, it's not that uncommon. But how many times have either you read in a story or you personally have written in a story that the character has green eyes? Do you know how common green eyes are? Well, I did a little research, and here's some interesting stats about eye color when you look at it from a world perspective. The most common color is brown, followed by blue, and when we go down the list, less than 2% of the population have green eyes. I see a lot of gray eyes too. Well, that's less than 1% of the population. So it's one of those things that writers like to do because, that makes them very distinct. But there's a lot more that we can add to characters than just their eye color. And sometimes people notice that, and sometimes people don't notice that. But what else can you use that's more interesting and not so uncommon that it becomes almost laughable when you actually recognize how common these other colors are? So, some final thoughts. In writing your books, you're more than likely going to have some secondary characters. And if you've already written quite a bit, pick one of these secondary characters and write down 4 things, like I did for Louisa, that make them stand out, that make them different. And have you done that? Can you name 4 things? If you can't name 4 things that make them different, then perhaps they're more of a signpost. If you've done way more than 4 things and you can write several pages on what makes them different, perhaps they're not a secondary character. So there are some thoughts on secondary characters.